In this video, I'd like to present the paper Medical Innovation, Life Expectancy and Economic Growth, which is written together with Michael Kuhn from the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, Antonio Minetti from the University of Bologna, and Francesco Venturini from the University of Perugia. The starting point for this paper is the observation that life expectancy and income are positively correlated. So this is the famous Preston curve relationship, where we've depicted here the Preston curve for the year 2015, the red dots, and for 1960, the blue dots. And what we see is that the positive association between life expectancy and per capita GDP is concave. That's not surprising because we have absolute values of income here. If we take the logarithm so that we would compare life expectancy with percentage increases in income, then we would see a more linear relationship. What you also see is that the Preston curve shifted over time. So for the same level of income in 1960, people would live longer if they had the same income in 2015. So this is an upward shift of the Preston curve that is likely due to medical progress in large part. So it's clear that life expectancy and income are positively correlated, but there are at least three complications in the whole relationship that are important to address. The first is that there is a two-way causality. Of course, health will affect economic growth. So if people are healthier, they are more productive. That means they can work more and longer, and that increases per capita GDP. But there are also indirect effects. So if people live longer, they tend to invest more in their education through the Ben-Borat mechanism, or they also tend to save more, and therefore a country with people who live longer tends to invest more, and that could have effects on economic growth. However, there is also the reverse causal channel that higher per capita income allows a society to invest more in hospitals. Then in such a society, you typically have the situation that people are better nourished, there is a better hygienic standard, and so on and so forth, and all that raises income. So you have a two-way causality that needs to be disentangled. Second, there are common drivers of both, and the most obvious one is innovation. Innovation has been identified as the main driving force of economic growth, as we also know from the Roma type of growth models. But at the same time, innovation drives improvements in health, so medical innovation. And therefore, these aspects need to be controlled for. And here we want to contribute by controlling for both general innovation or industrial innovation on the one hand, and medical innovation on the other. And the third point is that there are crucial non-linearities in the relationship between income and health. So in early stages of development, or also in early stages of the epidemiological transition, better health would mainly increase the growth rate of the population, and particularly the growth rate of young cohorts first, because child mortality decreases. But that would not yet increase economic growth, because the productivity of the working age population would not yet be affected that much. In intermediate stages of the epidemiological transition and of development, we would have the cardiac revolution. And the cardiac revolution has strong positive effects on the health of the working age population. So if you prevent a heart attack, you increase remaining life expectancy quite a lot. And people tend to have a much higher living standard, of course, afterwards, and be much more productive, and therefore a comparatively low health intervention with comparatively low resource requirements. So during that stage, it can be expected that health improvements have positive effects on economic growth because they come at relatively low resource requirements and have comparatively strong effects. At later stages of the epidemiological transition and of development, improvements in health basically occur for diseases that affect older people. So there is a transition towards cancer, dementia, and all these kind of diseases. And they are much more resource intensive to treat, and in addition, the increase in life expectancy that you get for treating one of these diseases successfully is comparatively low, because you have other diseases that you may get comparatively quickly. Second, the fact that health improves at that stage is something that is definitely worth cheering for. But if we are interested in the growth effects of health improvements, we have to acknowledge that in this late stage of development, it's mainly people beyond their working age who benefit from health improvements. And of course, one could expect that this has lower effects on economic growth than in intermediate stages of development. And our aim in the paper is now to address all three of these aspects by first proposing an endogenous economic growth model that can capture the non-linearities and the different mechanisms, and then assess these mechanisms on evidence based on historical data from 1890 to 2010, basically, for high-income countries nowadays. Now, what does the literature say on this up to now? Well, the earliest papers that addressed the effect of health on economic growth were based on the convergence growth regressions of Barrow and Salah-Martin in the 1990s. And they basically included health, usually in the form of life expectancy, as a regressor, and concluded based on the fact that growth over certain decades was regressed on initial life expectancy, and the coefficient of initial life expectancy was positive, that life expectancy has a positive effect on economic growth. In addition, the coefficient size was comparatively high, so that life expectancy could have expected to have a strong effect on economic growth, and it was significant in many different regressions. So in this paper by Salah-Martin, Doppelhofer, and Miller, where they have millions of regressions based on Bayesian estimation, they find that in almost all of them, life expectancy is a positive predictor of economic growth. Of course, later papers have criticized the identifying assumption here that it is sufficient that regressing something on initial life expectancy establishes causality, and they rather tried to get other ways of establishing causality. For example, the literature based on microeconomic estimates that was mainly initiated by David Weil and also Ed Bleakley have contributed to that. And there, what they do is mainly to derive the effects of health on individual productivity from Minserian wage regressions. And arguably, since you have many more data points there, and in addition, you can perform things like twin studies and so on, you can much better identify the causal effect of health on individual productivity at the microeconomic level. And then if you aggregate these effects up to the macroeconomic level, they claimed to have derived the macroeconomic effect of health based on microeconomic estimates. What they find is that actually there is a causal positive effect of health on economic growth via this channel, but it is much smaller than the one that is found by the macroeconomic estimates earlier. Now, this is not so surprising actually, because this focuses only on the direct effect of health on productivity and therefore economic growth, but it does not contain the indirect effects of health through education and investment. Then Acemoglu and Johnson tried to establish causality at the macroeconomic level by a clever identification strategy, where they instrumented improvements in health by changes in medical technology that happened exogenously, or happened basically at the worldwide level, so that they are exogenous to developments of income within one country. And what they find is actually that the effect of health on growth is insignificant, with a point estimate even being negative. Of course, this sparked a lot of debate, and a lot of papers afterwards tried to find out why there is this discrepancy between the different literatures. And Cervellati and Sunde actually reconcile these two different results by doing the same estimates and the same instrumenting strategy as Acemoglu and Johnson did, but splitting the sample into the countries before the demographic transition and after the demographic transition. And what they find out is that after the demographic transition, there is indeed a significant positive effect of health and economic growth, but before the demographic transition, the effect is insignificant. So this shows that non-linearities in the context are crucially important. And what we try to do in our contribution is, first of all, to propose a theory that captures the different channels and the non-linearities. And here we put emphasis on the facts that we can generate these non-linearities using a research and development-based economic growth model, while Acemoglu and Johnson was motivated with the Solovian growth model and the negative effect of capital dilution on economic growth, while Cervellati and Sunde's paper was based on the Malthusian framework, basically. And so here we try to establish the three stages, actually, where later on the effects of health and economic growth become smaller and potentially negative again by research and development-based economic growth theory. Then we want to use long-run macroeconomic data from 1890 to 2010 in order to cover all the three phases and to show that this nonlinearity is very important. And finally, we include medical innovation and industrial innovation as control variables where we have patent data on medical patents and general patents, basically, that we can both use to control for the effects of innovation that shift the Preston curve. After I have sketched the basic contribution of our paper, now let's go a little bit more into the details. So here we have the structure and the assumptions of the model framework, where we merge three strands of the literature actually. The endogenous growth literature according to Roma with endogenous research and development-based economic growth. Then the overlapping generations framework of Blanchard with a constant risk of death at each moment in time. And the extension of Bauta that allows for positive population growth. And third, the literature on endogenous healthcare, where we assume that healthcare that reduces mortality depends positively on medical innovation, where we follow basically the literature, and here in particular the paper by Frankovic and Kuhn. So medical progress induces healthcare spending, and healthcare spending together with medical innovation reduces mortality, and this has repercussions on population growth and on investment savings decision. In such a setting, there are four sectors. We have the final goods sector, where all the goods and services are produced with one type of labor, the workers, and with intermediate inputs. The intermediate inputs in turn are produced out of physical capital, and before an intermediate input can be produced, the corresponding blueprint has to be bought from the research and development sector. So that works as in the Roma type of framework. So this, so that the firm has to buy a blueprint is an upfront investment, and then allows the intermediate goods producer to be the exclusive producer of this particular good for which it has the patent. So there is a certain differentiation of intermediate goods and monopolistic competition. So the intermediate goods producers earn operating profits, and the discounted stream of these operating profits is used to pay for the patents from the research and development sector. The research and development sector in turn supplies the blueprints that are bought by the intermediate goods sector and produces them with the second type of labor in the economy, the scientists and engineers basically. And then there is a healthcare sector. The healthcare sector employs healthcare personnel, doctors, nurses, and so on, to reduce mortality according to the Blanchard-Bauta type of overlapping generation structure, and therefore affects saving decisions and population growth. But in turn, the healthcare sector requires personnel, and these labor resources are not anymore available for research and development and final goods production. So there is a certain trade-off that we have to take into account and that we model in this framework between putting a lot of resources in healthcare and therefore leaving fewer resources for research and development, or putting less resources in healthcare but having a lower life expectancy and lower population growth. Now, as I said, the demographic structure follows Blanchard and Bauter, where we have population growth as the difference between the fertility rate and the mortality rate. And the mortality rate depends on healthcare utilization, lowercase h, and medical progress, uppercase m. So medical progress, as we will see later on, and healthcare both reduce the mortality rate. The fertility rate is interpreted as the net fertility rate, so net of child mortality. So medical progress reduces child mortality and therefore increases the net fertility rate. Here, healthcare investment does not show up yet because the assumption is that lowercase h is basically benefiting people over their life cycle. So if a person is born, they do not yet have healthcare spending. And the population growth rate is then the difference between the two and depends also on healthcare and medical innovation. And then to come up with the population size at time t, we have to integrate over all cohorts that are alive. So we integrate from minus infinity up to today, so date t, and what we get is the population size, the initial population size n0 multiplied by the growth factor of the population that is determined by the population, that is given by the population growth rate in the exponent. Now, the population growth rate, mortality, and so on, they always depend on these variables here. But from now on, I suppress the arguments in the function if there is no kind of problem of mixing things up and if this does not cause any confusion. In addition, it's important to say at this stage already what we do. So we have a model framework that we can solve for the growth rate of the economy, basically, but we do not fully close it. We leave medical innovation as our variable according to which we pursue comparative statics exercises. So we change medical innovation, which induces healthcare spending, and then we analyze how these two changes affect the economy and particularly how they affect the growth rate. And we will see that this depends a lot on the stage in which an economy finds itself in the epidemiological transition. With regards to the healthcare sector, we assume that 1 unit of labor produces 1 unit of medical treatment. So the total amount of medical treatment that are supplied in equilibrium, that's the total amount of labor employed in healthcare. And on the left-hand side, we have total demand for healthcare, which is demand for healthcare of 1 person. So that's the population size multiplied by the population size is the total amount of healthcare in the economy. And healthcare per person is then the supplied healthcare divided by the population size, of course. And then we assume that medical technology and healthcare, they both reduce mortality, so the mortality rate mu, but with weakly decreasing returns. So here we have that medical progress would reduce the mortality rate through a direct effect, that is mortality reducing. So if there's medical progress and the state of knowledge in the medical sector is increasing, then this reduces the mortality rate. But at the same time, medical progress induces healthcare spending, and this healthcare spending in turn also reduces mortality. However, with weakly decreasing returns, so that it's reasonable that getting a reduction in life expectancy becomes increasingly hard the higher life expectancy already is. And that's also what we observe in reality and what I said before. So it's comparatively easy to prevent a heart attack and thereby to increase life expectancy quite a lot. But in terms of cancer and other old age diseases, basically, it becomes ever more difficult to get increases in life expectancy out for a given use of resources, or by the same token, it becomes increasingly more resource intensive to get a certain increase in life expectancy. Now let's come to the individual maximization problem. So individuals maximize their utility, which is given by consumption over the life cycle according to a concave function. So consumption increases utility, but with decreasing returns. So we just, for simplicity, assume a logarithmic function here. And the future is discounted with the discount rate rho. and with the rate of mortality, because if an individual faces a risk of death, then this individual is less likely to postpone consumption into the future as compared to an individual who does not face the risk of death, of course. Assets are denoted by A, and they accumulate according to this flow budget constraint here, where we have the first term is asset income, consisting of interest income on assets plus the redistribution of annuity markets, because we assume there is a perfect annuity market. So people buy a life insurance company actually, and those people who die, the wealth of them is redistributed among the ones who survive in case of a fair life insurance company. In other words, there the rate of return on assets is augmented by the mortality rate in case of a fair life insurance company. So this is then asset income. Then we have wage income, which is wage income that somebody would earn if they supply the whole available time on the labor market. But we already substitute in healthcare, so we can write this as that healthcare investments show up here in the budget constraint as if they were time investments of a person. So that's then labor income. And if we subtract consumption expenditures, we get total savings. So here we have total income, that's consumption expenditures, the difference is saving. And if that is positive, then assets accumulate, so they increase. If it's negative, then assets decumulate, the time derivative is negative and assets decrease. And the result, of course, of this optimization problem is the well-known consumption-Euler equation, where we have consumption expenditure growth on the left-hand side. And this is positive if and only if the interest rate, which is what the financial markets pay us to compensate us for our impatience, which is the time preference rate, if this compensation is higher than the time preference rate, then we have consumption growth. Consumption growth means consuming less today and more in the future, so having a steeper consumption growth path. And that happens in case of an interest rate being higher than the rate of time preference. By contrast, if the opposite holds true, then we have decreasing consumption over time, which is this saving. So I consume a lot today and less in the future. Now this would be the end of the story of the consumption side in a representative agent framework, but we do not have representative agents here. Instead, we have to integrate over all cohorts that are alive at a certain point in time to come up with the evolution of aggregate consumption and aggregate assets, which are denoted by uppercase C, that's aggregate consumption, and omega, which is the evolution of aggregate assets. So always uppercase variables refer to aggregates and lowercase variables to a cohort or per capita variables. Now what we see here is the aggregate Euler equation consists of the individual Euler equation, but there are two additional terms. Population growth shows up with a positive sign. That's reasonable because ceteris paribus, if the population grows faster, then aggregate consumption also grows faster. And then we have the so-called turnover correction term, which shows up because at each moment in time, a fraction of people die, and they are already older and have accumulated assets, and therefore they can afford more consumption. And when they die, they are replaced by newborns without assets who can afford less consumption. So this continuously ongoing process of births and deaths slows down aggregate consumption expenditure growth as compared to individual consumption expenditure growth. And that's the so-called turnover correction term that appears here in the aggregate Euler equation, but not in the individual Euler equation. With respect to the aggregate asset accumulation equation, the only thing that changes actually from the individual equation is that the mu integrates out because the life insurance company only redistributes wealth between cohorts, but it does not generate wealth itself. And of course, here we multiply with the total population size, the income level. This already concludes the description of the consumption side, and we now come to the description of the production side, which is fairly standard as in the standard Roma type of growth model, where we sterilize the scale effect. So here we have the final goods production, which happens with the first type of labor, so the workers in the final goods sector, with an output elasticity of 1 minus alpha, and intermediates with an output elasticity of alpha. We do not have only one intermediate, we have as many intermediates as we have blueprints in the economy, so we have to integrate over all these intermediates from 0 to the state of technology AT. And then we can use this to compute the factor rewards. The wage rate in equilibrium will be the marginal product of the production factor labor from here. So this is the derivative of the production function with respect to Ly. And the price for intermediates, Pi, is the derivative of the production function with respect to Xi. So this is then this expression here, and this expression here can then be used as a side constraint in the profit maximization problem of the intermediate goods producer, as we will see next. So the intermediate goods producer produces the intermediates according to a one-for-one technology. So 1 unit of physical capital is transformed into 1 unit of the intermediate good. That's without loss of generality. So one can assume different capital input coefficients, but it wouldn't change the results in the end in a qualitative way. So that then the profits of the intermediate goods producer are equal to the price that they can charge for their product multiplied by the amount they produce. That's equal to the capital that one firm employs, because we have this one-to-one technology. That's the revenue. And if we subtract the cost, which is the interest payments on the capital that the firm rents, then we get the profits. Now we can plug in from the previous slide the PIT here, and what we get is this expression here. And if we take now maximization, therefore take the derivative of this expression with respect to Ki, then we can derive the profit maximizing pricing strategy, where the price would be a markup over marginal cost. The marginal cost is the interest rate, and the markup is 1 over alpha. So firms have market power in this sector. They charge a price that is higher than the marginal cost. Therefore, they make operating profits. And then they use the discounted stream of their operating profits to pay for the patent from the R&D sector. Why do they do that? Well, because that's the optimal thing to do, because there is free entry into the intermediate goods producing sector. So whenever a firm would bid a lower price for the patent, then there would always be another firm willing to outbid this firm. So in equilibrium, the total stream of discounted operating profits will be used to pay for the patent. There is another consequence of profit maximization in the intermediate goods sector, and that is that firms behave symmetrically. So all the firms in the intermediate goods sector charge the same price. The index I for the different firms does not show up on the right-hand side. And that means we can rewrite aggregate output as a Cobb-Douglas in form of a Cobb-Douglas production function with labor augmenting technological progress, where AT multiplies with the number of workers. The value of all assets is the value of physical capital plus the value of patents. The stock of patents is AT and the value of a patent VA, and that's also the value of a firm in the intermediate goods sector, because the firm uses the discounted stream of operating profits to pay for the patents. And aggregate GDP would be output at time t plus the value of output in the healthcare sector plus the value of output in the R&D sector, which is the change in the stock of blueprints, so the newly produced blueprints, multiplied with the value of blueprints VA. Now there is one final sector that needs to be specified before we can quote-unquote close the economy, but we don't really close it. Instead, we use medical innovation and healthcare to do the comparative statics. But what we still need to do is to specify the research and development sector, industrial R&D, general R&D, where the change in blueprints, so the new blueprints are produced with scientists, LA, so the second type of workers. We assume here that the share of scientists matters, that's to sterilize the scale effect. New is the productivity of scientists, and AT are the intertemporal knowledge spillovers, that it becomes easier to produce future technologies if you know how to produce past technologies, basically. Then the equilibrium condition is that the compensation for research is equal to the costs of research. The cost is the wage bill of scientists on the right-hand side, so wages multiplied by the number of scientists employed. And the compensation for research is now the value of the newly produced patents, because there is free entry. So otherwise, if this were higher, then people would enter this sector and there would be more employment. So in equilibrium, this equation must hold true. And then we can solve for labor employed in final goods production, or the share of labor employed in final goods production. And we observe three important relations. If the interest rate goes up, that means that the discounted stream of operating profits in the intermediate goods sector is lower because the discount rate is higher. So research and development, the value of patents, would decrease, and there is less incentive to carry out research and development. Therefore, the fraction of workers in the final goods sector would go up, and the fraction of workers in R&D would go down. By contrast, if the value of patents increases faster, so if this growth rate is higher, that means that the incentives to carry out research and development are higher, and therefore the fraction of people employed in final goods production would be lower, and the fraction of people employed in R&D would be higher. And of course, if the productivity of scientists is higher, that also means that the fraction of workers in the final goods sector is lower, and the fraction of scientists would be higher. Now we can quote unquote close the economy by assuming that we are on a balanced growth path, where the growth rate of the economy is given at the rate G. The growth rate in the value of patents is given by the population growth rate, and labor markets clear. So labor employed in healthcare plus labor employed in research and development plus labor employed in the final goods sector is equal to the total stock of labor in the economy. And this now allows us to derive a system of three equations in three unknowns: the interest rate, the growth rate of the economy, and the consumption to asset ratio, but also the variables on which we perform the comparative statics, basically healthcare and medical innovation that drives healthcare. The first equation is derived from the production function in the research and development sector. The second equation is the aggregate Euler equation, and the third equation comes from the aggregate asset accumulation equation. Now, in principle, we could solve the three-dimensional system here for the endogenous variables, the interest rate, the growth rate, and the consumption to asset ratio. But we are more interested in a comparative statics exercise where we change medical progress exogenously, analyze how this influences healthcare utilization, population growth, and mortality, and thereby then the growth rate of the economy. And we analyze how this differs in the different stages of the economy. To do this, we draw two graphs. On the left-hand side, we have a graph in the space of the interest rate and the consumption to asset ratio. That's a two-dimensional projection of this three-dimensional system into the space of the interest rate and the consumption asset ratio. And on the right-hand side, we have a two-dimensional projection into the space of the interest rate and the growth rate of the economy, G. Now, on the left-hand side, we draw two curves. The first curve is when we take the first equation and put it set it equal to the second equation here. This gives us a downward sloping curve RD in the space of the interest rate and the consumption to asset ratio. If we take the first and the third equation, then we get an upward sloping curve in this space, the RU equation. And here in this right figure, we draw equation number 1, which is a negative relationship between the interest rate and the economic growth rate. Now we ask ourselves what happens if there is medical progress, so if M increases. Now in early stages of development, M does not yet induce a lot of additional healthcare spending age. Medical innovation mainly reduces child mortality. That means it increases population growth, but only growth of the young cohorts. It does not yet increase growth of the working age population. That basically means that N increases, and these two curves shift upwards, so the RD and the RU curve, so that we will get an intersection between the two curves at a higher interest rate, while the effect on the consumption asset ratio is ambiguous, but the interest rate will definitely increase. What happens to the growth rate of the economy now depends on the reaction of the RG curve. If the RG curve shifts up only slightly, then we end up in equilibrium E2 with a reduction in the growth rate. If by contrast the RG curve shifts up more pronouncedly, we end up in equilibrium E3 with an increase in the growth rate of the economy. Now we would argue that the reaction of the RG curve depends on the stage of development. In early stages of development, the RG curve will only shift slightly upwards because the main effect of medical progress is to reduce child mortality, and therefore the young cohorts grow fast and you have something like an inverse demographic dividend, whereby the growth rate of the economy decreases. However, in more intermediate stages of development, you get more and more progress against cardiac diseases and against mortality at the working age of the population. So therefore, the population would grow at working ages, and that means you get more people available for production and for research and development. And therefore, for a given interest rate, the increase in the growth rate would be higher. So the RG curve would shift up more in this case. In addition, if life expectancy increases, people save more and invest more, and this additional saving and investment puts a downward pressure on the interest rate. So for a given increase in the interest rate, as it is depicted here, we would have a stronger effect in the growth rate. So for intermediate stages of development or for intermediate stages in the epidemiological transition, we would get a positive effect of medical progress on economic growth. Now assume medical progress continues further and we come to later stages of the intermediate stage of development, then the medical progress becomes ever more demanding in terms of health investments. So age actually here would then increase. It becomes ever more resource intensive to get a certain reduction in the mortality rate out of a certain increase in healthcare spending or in medical progress. So that means that the two curves RU and RD shift downwards again because resources are subtracted that would be available for research and development and for production. That means in turn that the interest rate will surely decrease, but we cannot say again what happens to the consumption asset relationship, but that's also not important. What's important is that the interest rate decreases. Now again, two things can happen to the growth rate of the economy. If the curve RG shifts downwards only slightly, we end up in equilibrium E2 with a higher growth rate. But if it shifts downwards more pronouncedly, we end up in equilibrium E3 with a reduction in the economic growth rate. And here we again argue that in earlier stages of the third stage of the epidemiological transition, basically, or in intermediate stages of development, we would have that the RG curve only shifts slightly because there we still have kind of the cardiac revolution and reductions in mortality at working ages and so on and so forth. But the more an economy develops and the later we get in the epidemiological transition, the more and more resources the healthcare sector would require and the more and more the RG curve will shift downwards. In the end, if it's mainly cancers and so on, that we have to fight against, that's very resource intensive, and then definitely the effect here of the reduction in terms of employment that we have in final goods production and R&D due to the expanding healthcare sector would dominate the effect on the interest rate that still works in the direction that people would save more and invest more, which would also increase the incentives to carry out research and development because the interest rate decreases and the future operating profits are discounted at a lower rate. But this effect would then, in later stages of the epidemiological transition, definitely be overcompensated by the reduction in resources in terms of personnel that we have available for R&D and production because the healthcare sector requires so many resources. So in late stages, we would have a negative effect of medical progress on the economic growth rate. And that means that we can derive two testable hypotheses. The first one is that there is a causal pathway from medical innovation to economic growth, and an important transmission channel in this whole context is the expansion of life expectancy. That's what is directly derived from the model. And the second hypothesis tells us that the overall effect of medical innovation on economic growth is, however, non-linear. It's negative in early stages of development or early stages of the epidemiological transition, because there mainly young cohorts grow and we get an inverse demographic dividend. In intermediate stages of the epidemiological transition or development, we would get a positive effect of medical progress on economic growth, because it's mainly the working age population that benefits, and the benefits that we get, they are not yet so resource intensive. But in late stages of development and later stages of the epidemiological transition, we would get smaller and potentially even negative effects of medical progress on economic growth. And this is now what we test in the empirical part of the paper, where we set up a co-integration framework to estimate the relationship between health and economic growth, where we have the logarithm of per capita GDP on the left-hand side and regress it on the logarithm of medical progress, logarithm of general innovation or industrial innovation, logarithm of life expectancy, and number of control variables, and the error correction term. The main variables that we have cover the time period from 1890 to 2010. There's income from the long-run productivity data set, medical and industrial patterns for the comprehensive universe of United States patents, and OECD data set, where we can kind of disentangle medical from industrial patents. We have life expectancy at birth from our world in data, and we include in the paper, that's not what I show here, but in the paper, in the appendix, various control variables such as trade openness, government size, private credit to GDP ratio, proxies for physical and human capital, and knowledge spillovers between different countries, but they do not change our estimation results, basically. The specification is chosen according to stationarity tests, co-integration tests, and weak exogeneity tests, which tell us basically that variables are integrated of order 1, so we can use them in the co-integration model. There is one co-integrating relationship, and weak exogeneity tests suggest that causality mainly runs from the right-hand side variables to the left-hand side variable. This table contains the results of the estimation when we do not take into account sample splits or non-linearities. And what we find here in the first column is that medical innovation has a positive and highly significant effect on economic growth. If we split medical innovation up into medical equipment and pharmaceuticals, both retain significance. If we only include longevity, then this is also statistically highly significant and positive. And if we include industrial innovation, it's also highly significant and positive. Now, it's important to see that the coefficient of medical innovation is much smaller than the coefficient of industrial innovation, which is to be expected because industrial innovation increases productivity directly, and medical innovation perhaps only via certain other effects, and that some of the medical equipment innovation may also be helpful in fostering economic growth. Now, the important question, however, is what happens if we include all of them in one specification. That's in column 5. And we see here the significance of longevity is still here and important, that the coefficient size even increases from column 3 to column 5, which implies that longevity is an important transmission channel of the effect of medical innovation on growth. Medical innovation, the coefficient size decreased strongly, but nevertheless it's still significant. Industrial innovation also gained in importance, the coefficient size increased. So here is still some spillover of medical innovation on economic growth, for example, because some of the equipment innovations can still be used to increase economic growth. That's also what we see when we split up medical innovation here into equipment innovation and pharmaceutical innovation. Pharmaceutical innovation is only significant at the 10% level anymore, while medical equipment is still significant at the 1% level, and the coefficient size even increased. So all of these results are consistent with our hypothesis 1, that medical innovation there is a causal channel of medical innovation to economic growth, and an important transmission channel is the effect on longevity. Now, however, we also want to test hypothesis 2, that there is a non-linearity in this relationship. And for this purpose, we here replicate our column 5 from here. And then we do two things basically. First, a sample split into countries before the demographic transition and after the demographic transition, which is where we make the distinction based on life expectancy of 50 years, which is the same threshold as Cervelati and Sunde use it, and which is by coincidence also the transition from the second stage of the epidemiological transition to the third stage of the epidemiological transition as classified by Omran in his paper from 1998. What we see when we do this is that medical innovation only has a positive coefficient estimate in the post-transition countries, but it has a negative and statistically significant effect in the pre-transition countries. And that's highly consistent with the results of Cervelati and Sunde, that in our case, medical innovation is only beneficial for post-transition countries, but not for pre-transition countries. In our case, the mechanism is slightly different from Cervelati and Sunde, but the results are basically the same, as we will also see later on when we take together the effects of medical innovation and longevity on economic growth. They are together negative in early stages of development. However, we can do a little bit better also. Instead of doing a sample split, we can do an interaction term. So here in column 4, we interact medical innovation with a post-transition dummy. So therefore, we can use the whole sample size. And we see the medical innovation coefficient is negative and highly significant, while the interaction term is positive and highly significant. So again, confirm being in support of our hypothesis 2 that there is a nonlinear relationship, and in early stages of development the effect is negative, in late stages of development the effect is positive. And in the last column we interact medical innovation with longevity. That has to be taken with caution because both of them are I1, so the product is not I1 anymore, and therefore one may not use dynamic estimates, but we also use static estimates later on. We will see this also, and they lead to quite similar results as the dynamic estimates. Still, we find the same results as here. So medical innovation has a negative coefficient sign, a negative coefficient here, and the coefficient of the interaction term is positive and highly significant. Overall, what we can see by means of a graph is, irrespective of whether we use a dynamic estimate or a static estimate here for column 5, we always find that for low levels of longevity, so here we have the percentiles of longevity, the effect of medical innovation on economic growth is negative, and then at some point it turns positive. For the static estimates after 53.7 years of life expectancy, and in case of the dynamic estimates after 57.9 years of life expectancy, which is all remarkably close to the transition point from the second to the third stage of the epidemiological transition, or the transition threshold that Cervelati and Sunde used in their paper of 50 years, basically for pre- and post-demographic transition countries. Afterwards, the effect of medical innovation on economic growth is positive, but it levels off. So the positive effect becomes smaller, it's concave. Now we can also put together the effects of longevity and medical progress on economic growth and estimate this effect country by country here actually. And what we find for this combined effect is that for low levels of longevity, the combined effect is negative and significant. For intermediate stages of longevity, it's positive and significant. And for late stages with a high level of life expectancy, the point estimate turns negative again, but it's not yet significant. But overall, this would be in support of our hypothesis 2, that we observe a nonlinear relationship of health and economic growth. For early stages of development, the effect is negative. For intermediate stages, it's definitely positive, and for late stages it becomes weaker again and potentially even negative. So then we can summarize all the effects. We've shown that there is a causal effect of medical innovation on life expectancy and economic growth, but it is non-linear. In early stages of development, the effect is negative, which is in line with Cervelati and Sunde's paper. In intermediate stages, it's positive, which is in line with the literature that finds a positive effect of health on economic growth, say from the 1960s onwards to 2010 or so. So there are many papers showing such a positive effect, and also the microeconomic literature to which I have made reference to previously also finds such a positive relationship, and that's basically in our intermediate stages of development. And in late stages of development and for an aging population, the effect becomes weaker again and potentially even negative. And this is reasonably so, as we've shown, because it becomes ever more difficult to get a certain health effect by one has to commit more and more resources actually to healthcare. And overall, from a policy perspective, it's important to take these non-linearities into account when making policy recommendations for different countries on whether or not to invest in health and whether this has positive or negative growth effects.